Hello, thank you so much for joining me today. I have for you a little drafting project as well as a little bit of information about how to use a sloper and why sometimes it doesn't seem like it's working the way you expect it to. For me, it is always contour lines. So I kind of cover contour lines a little bit and just give you an idea maybe what to expect in that front. I'm still kind of new to it all though, so I'm going to include down below some resources for not only a website that goes over contour lines in really good detail, but also other drafters on YouTube here. One is Zoe DIY, excellent. The other is The Closet Historian, also fantastic. Just so you have more resources to go check out. But without further ado, let's get into it. Hello. So today I kind of want to tell you about what the purpose of a sloper is when it comes to drafting. It is my preferred method of drafting, of course. You've seen them crop up in my channel a few times, and I do try to make one for every different doll that I have because I find them a really great resource. But the question some people have is why? What do you do with it? So it is, at its core, just a perfect fit, or as perfect as you can get it, fit of one body type. So in the case of my HID, other dolls would probably be able to wear this, but it might not fit as nicely. And the idea is that now that I know how a basic thing fits on it, I can turn this basic thing into whatever I want it to be. And in some cases, you can literally just draw in a new, say you want a V-neck. You can just draw in a V-neck and make a pattern piece with that. There are certain changes that complicate things because nothing is ever as simple as just draw what you want on this and go. Practically speaking, you can do that and just do a couple of test fittings to figure out what's going on. The reason it doesn't always work right off the bat is I've got my Rosalind here again, but the reason it might not necessarily fit right off the bat is this gap right here. There's actually technically a gap up here as well if this had been pulled perfectly straight, but it's not nearly as noticeable. Yeah, there's a little gap there too. So that gap, this quite large gap, actually will affect the fit, because if I were to cut my sloper, say I want to make empire waist something, and I'm like, okay, I'll cut my sloper up here. Well, when this sloper fits, this is that sloper. When this sloper fits, it fits assuming that it's okay that there's a gap there. When you bring this up, that gap is actually not going to look very good. You actually want it to fit more like that. And the way that that's combated in professional stuff is with what's called contour lines. And I only kind of know the basics of contour lines, but the idea is that the breast itself kind of gets its own little circle here. And then your contour lines mostly come from your apex, but they kind of end up looking like this. There's one that's here, there's one that goes into the neckline, there's one that goes, I think there's one that goes into here. I'm literally just going based off what I remember. There's a big one that goes to center front. I am making all of this up clearly, but this is the basic idea. And the idea would be, okay, if I decided I want this to be an empire waist and I'm going to cut this a lot higher, I need to account for this contour line that we have come across. So in this case, anything below the contour line would be that. Above it, that would be accounted for in the dart. So your dart would need to be wider to pull this in more over that bust. And with these other ones, sometimes like this one is kind of an important one because it will affect, I mean, they're all important, but this one will affect if there's gapping at your bust line. So say you want like a super low bust or collar. Super low collar, not bust line, collar line, sorry. Like way down there. This is going to need to be taken out as a dart. And you can move that fullness into one of these other darts if you want, but it needs to be accounted for, or when it's on the doll, it's going to do that bubble thing that I hate so much at the collar line. So, and then this one is usually for like the super plunging necklines. You really got to account for those. So this is kind of like the gap between boobs. This is the collar. This is anything that's going to count, like open up the arm side, or you know, if you decide you want a bigger arm side, or you know, whatever. You kind of get the drift. So there's more than just these ones that I've drawn in. I know that you kind of do something with the side seam too sometimes, depending on if your block was made with sleeves in mind or not. Like, it's reality is always going to be more complicated than the beauty of like, oh, just draw what you want and sew it. But these are still great because they're still a really good starting point. And if you know about the contour lines going in, even if you don't know like exactly what they need to be, because like I have no idea for this, I don't know, I just made these up. But knowing that I'm gonna need to, you know, maybe widen some of my darts a little bit if I decide to move this up, or if I decide to do a plunging neckline, or, you know, going forward, that's all information that I take into account when I am making stuff up wholesale. So I know this isn't like specifically a how-to, this is more of a PSA, like, hey, contour lines are a thing. It's worth knowing about if you get into the weeds of drafting and, you know, you're pretty serious about this. If you're a beginner and this all sounds really intimidating and like too much information, don't worry about it. Just do test fittings. The more test fittings that you do, the more you're going to get a feel for like, oh, hey, when I made this change, it affected this. And like that practical experience is really going to help you, I think. So, you know, this is just kind of, I'm going to include down below some stuff, like basically where I learned the most about contour lines was actually just an online like free thing that some wonderful woman put up, and so I will include that below if you want to read about this in detail. It is of course assuming you're sewing for humans, but that's fine because the basics are the same, especially when it comes to drafting, so I'll include that down below for you. I hope this information helps you going forward, and I am going to try to include more projects that involve drafting starting today with this one. This is going to be for HID. Since I made the slipper, I might as well use it, and I sketched out a simple dress design that's heavily inspired by something that Zoe DIY made. I'm going to link her down below. She's an amazing resource for drafting in general. She drafts, of course, for people mostly, well, completely for people. She doesn't do dolls, but a lot of her stuff is for adult women, and she's been recently doing a few things for kids, and just a fantastic resource. Highly recommend if you want to learn more about drafting. This one I'm gonna do the bodice. I ended up going a different direction with the skirt, and I didn't include the little belt thing, but for now we're gonna do the bodice. And the first thing I do is trace out my block and set my other block to the side because I don't want to wreck that one. That's kind of my default. I need that on hand. So when I do this, I do need to keep in mind that the block does have seam allowance on it. So I will actually cut all that seam allowance off. It makes drafting while I go much easier, and then when I have something I'm happy with, I will include all the seam allowance back in. I made a light line that is perpendicular to the center front line, and I just kind of picked about how low I wanted that to go under her armpit. I probably could have gone a little bit lower, but oh well. And then I very arbitrarily picked a line to go up towards the shoulder, and this is where those contour lines are coming in. I sort of guessed an amount to take out of this top as a dart because I knew I would need to take some out. I didn't know how much, so I just kind of made it up. And here I'm just sort of fiddling with my lines and making sure both sides are of that dart are equal lengths. And then I'm going to go and cut these pieces out. So there's the center front piece, and then there's a side front piece. And the darts just get cut out completely because these are two separate pieces. And then the side dart, I cut along the length of the dart, and then I just close it. So that is pretty much the fastest princess seam you'll see. Then for the back piece, I knew I didn't really need the upper part of the back piece, so I just used the same piece of paper. I like to conserve paper when I can, you know? So I put the dart in, and then I traced in all those seam allowances because I'm going to cut those out again. And then I used the side piece that I had already made to figure out where that's going to be. I do that line perpendicular with the center back. I cut off my seam allowances. I did leave the center back seam allowance, you know, just made it easier for me. And then I removed the fullness out of that dart because it wasn't going to go anywhere, so I didn't need it there. And now I am going to cut these pieces out and make my first draft. So I just pinned these pieces on and gave myself enough room for seam allowances where I knew they'd be, and now I'm drawing the seam allowance I know that I would need onto the fabric itself. I just like doing it this way. I could have, you know, taped seam allowance onto the paper. You know, there's all kinds of different ways you can do this. I am not especially precious with my muslin when I'm making mock-ups, so I just draw on it. In retrospect, I probably could have ironed the muslin before cutting it out. That does tend to help. It just makes things easier, and it's also, like, sometimes you can get errors if the crinkles are too ridiculous, but I didn't. So on we go. The only seam allowance I added for this step was the stuff I knew I needed to sew. So I didn't add it along the very top, and I didn't add it to the bottom either because I want to see where those lines hit more precisely. So now I'm just pinning my side fronts to my center front pieces, and they do line up pretty nicely. Because one is more curved than the other, you do need to sort of coax them a little bit, but it's not too bad with this particular one. Her bust to waist ratio isn't quite as extreme as some dolls, and that does help. Then I pin the side seams and I go ahead and sew those and try it on. I am actually pretty pleased with this. I do play around with it a little bit and decide to take a little bit more out of the very top of the princess seam, which, if you'll recall, was the dart that I made up wholesale, so it does kind of make sense. Before that though, while I'm getting a feel for everything, I do grab just some ribbon that was roughly the right thickness, And this is just going to give me an idea of how long the straps need to be, as well as help me visualize the fit. So I spend a while fussing with that and just essentially pin it to my mock-up and cut it to length. Once I've got the straps on, I start really looking at it and trying to decide how happy I am with the fit, and I start to notice a little bit of gapping between the strap and the underarm, and that's when I realized that the dart I created just hadn't taken enough fullness out to really make me happy with it. So I pinched it. And this is always tricky because you end up not having to pinch very much out, but it's still a significant amount, enough that it will visually affect the fit, so it's just fiddly work. Once I was happy with it, I took the rough draft off the doll, and I did end up removing the strap just to try and measure those teeny tiny little pinches I put into the fabric. That was when I realized it was about 3 millimeters on both sides. So I measured 3 millimeters in and then drew a gentle curving line to sort of accommodate for that change, and I snipped it out. Then I decided I was pretty confident that one change would be enough, so I decided to make my actual official pieces by tracing everything out and adding in all of the seam allowance that it would need. This process is pretty straightforward. I just trace them exactly, and since I know none of them have seam allowance except for that, 3/4 of an inch on the center back, I can just add in the 1/4 inch where it needs to be. Once I've finished tracing out and adding seam allowance to the front and the back pieces, I do move on to the straps, and I used my ribbon to figure out the length of it, and I decided that the strap could be 1/4 of an inch, so I make my whole piece 1 inch because of how I'm going to construct the strap, which we'll get into once we start constructing it, which is actually the next step. All the drafting is done. So for this project, I picked out this really lovely cotton lawn, and I cut 2 pieces of the front, 4 pieces of the side front, and 4 pieces of the back. Now I am pinning the front pieces together along that princess seam, and with these stripes I did kind of go out of my way to try to cut all of the pieces to be the same, to have the stripes in the same place so that the final product will end up looking more symmetrical. There is not really a way to line up the stripes to match perfectly along curved princess seams. They're always going to, reflect the curve of the seam, but I didn't mind about that so much. I just wanted the finished product to look symmetrical, and so I did that, and it was oddly satisfying. I don't work with stripes very often, but I actually really like this. Once the fronts were sewn together, I did also cut out my straps, and you can see I've folded them in quarters so that the raw edges are in the center, and I'm just going to stitch right along that open edge to close it with the top stitch. Once that's done, I pin them into the tip of that princess seam there, so that's where I wanted my straps to go when I pinned them on the mock-up, so that's where they're going to go on this one. And I sandwiched them between the 2 front pieces. And I had decided at this point which I wanted to be the front and which I wanted to be the back based on how the princess seams looked. So my lining is not quite as pretty as my outside piece. That's okay, it's the lining. Then I clip that little corner and fold everything right sides out, and then I do understitching right along the lining. I apparently didn't show that to the camera, apologies. Now I actually am going to seam rip the side seam of my mock-up so that I can figure out the angle that the strap in the back needs to go. I've noticed that with people, you don't need to do this as much as you do with dolls. And you will notice I make a mistake at this point. I'm, carefully lining everything up. I take forever to do this, only to sew it in a way that can't be flipped right sides out. All my raw edges were on the outside. I was like, wait, what have I done? So, yeah, so much time fiddling with this and getting it absolutely perfect before pinning it. So we're gonna skip past some of this. So here's where I realized my absolutely tragic mistake. Because when I flip this so that the raw edges are on the inside, it doesn't work. So let that be a lesson. Everybody makes mistakes always. At this point, I had to figure out how to fix it, and I did that off camera, and I will show you how I ended up fixing it. So basically, I ended up ripping the middle section. I didn't bother ripping the parts that I had sewn over multiple times because that's hard to rip and didn't actually need to be, so I just opened up the middle section so that I could mark the angle and the spot that that strap is on, and then essentially just flipped the back piece 180. Because when I open it up so that the nice sides are facing out, I need the strap to be facing in the correct direction. If that makes any sense. This is much harder to describe than I thought it would be, probably because I too struggled with it. But, so right now I've just got it pinned with the one pin. I know that this angle is correct. So what I did was marked the spot where my stitching line essentially on that back piece, and then I marked the exact same spot on the strap. And then I pull the strap out and I turn the back piece, and I make sure that the side seams are both facing the same direction, and I sandwich that strap between there and I line it up with the pin that we just put in. And this actually worked really, really well. Once I wrapped my brain around it, it was good. So I went ahead, I pinned that, and then I just sewed along that top of the center back to cement, where that strap is and keep all that in place. Once that's been sewn, you can see how I flip everything so that the nice sides are up, and now it actually lines up correctly and our strap isn't twisted or anything. So at this point I wanted to make absolutely sure that that strap was in correctly, so I'm pinning the side seams temporarily to do a quick fitting on my doll. And this was also to figure out how much of the center back I would want to fold over. She's not wearing her modesty tape right now, so I did take her off camera to slip that on. But once that's on, I do see it looks good. Everything's the way I want it to be. So I take it right back off again and pull all those pins out and start on the next step, which is I'm going to do an understitch on the back pieces to make sure that the fold looks nice, and it also helps keep the straps extra secure because you're running over the straps with another set of stitches. And then I go in and trim off all the excess from the inside while I still have access to it. And you don't want to trim too close to your stitching, especially if you have fabric that might be prone to fraying. This stuff was actually pretty good, so I didn't have to worry about it. But super fray fabric, you're going to want to leave stuff on the inside a little bit longer just to be on the safe side. And then I pinned the side seams together. The right side of the project gets pinned to the right side of the back side, and yeah, the lining, it gets confusing when your lining looks exactly like your fabric, but you know, sewed the side seams together. It was all one stitch, and then I sewed the back seam together. I decided I ended up needing to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this one. I did have a little bit of extra in the back because I use that extra when I have a single layer of stuff, but I didn't need it for this because I had a lining. Then I go ahead and push everything so that it's right sides out and looking pretty. Get it pressed, and oh my goodness, it's looking great. Pretty excited about that. The straps do pull in towards the center a little far, but I don't care because they fit beautifully and they look great from the front, so we're all good. So now we move on to the skirt. So this part ended up being a little confusing even for me. The part that's not confusing is that this is literally just a rectangle that I made the shorter part the width that I want, like I want the length of the skirt to be, and the long part of this is literally just gathered down from a big old piece of fabric. I'm gonna decide how much of it I need by trial and error. So I fold over 1/2 inch and I pin it to the right side of the lining. And this is me trying very hard to figure it out. So I'm doing it this way because it will make the front look really, really nice when we do it correctly. But you can see that the bottom of the skirt is currently with its right side facing up, and the part of the bodice that I had ironed down by about 1/4 inch is the front, the main fabric of the bodice. And right now I'm pinning the skirt to the lining, and I had just used my pleating foot to do these gathers because I really like how they look and I like how fast they are. So I'm just pinning along the lining carefully, and when I get to the end and I run out of lining but I still have skirt, I unpick a few of the stitches and actually just snip where I want the skirt to end. So I kind of let my pleating foot determine the gather density here and just rolled with it because I wanted as many gathers as I could get. And I don't regret doing it this way, though I do now have a little bit of fabric left over. With dolls, that's never a problem. I can just use it for a bodice for something else. But yeah, this ended up working really good. The only mistake I make is instead of having my 1/2 inch folded towards the back of the piece, I end up having it folded towards the front because I've never done it in quite this way before, and I definitely confused myself. But we'll fix that later. So here I've finally made it to the end, and I'm just measuring out that 1/2 inch by eye, and then I just put a little snip in there because I am taking full advantage of the fact that this fabric has a stripe on it, and I'm just gonna serge that edge right along that stripe. So now it's all nice and serged. I do take a moment to bury my serger thread. Using that little tiny little tool was something someone sent me, which was absolutely the sweetest thing ever. But this is here where you see I do fold it back the wrong way. And after stitching it down, I realize, oh no, I need to pull that. So here I am very, very carefully picking out those stitches so that I can fold that 1/2 inch towards the back of the piece, so that will end up being on the inside. And I stitch that back down again, and everything's fine now. So now, the reason I did it the confusing way is because I can pin the front of the bodice over the gathers, perfectly covering that last stitching line, and then I can use my edge stitch foot and stitch very, very, very close to this edge, and it ends up making a really beautiful finish along this front edge. So I really quite like this, actually, even though it's a little brain breaking. Once you get the hang of it, I think it might be worth it, because this really made it easy. I just left my gather stitches in so that they would hold my gathers steady, and there you can see the stitches ended up so beautiful. It was right up against the edge. I love that look. And the backside looks pretty good. I did slip off a few places, but I don't care because it's the lining. After that, I just take out all those gathering stitches because now that everything is firmly sewn in place, we don't need those and they don't look very nice. Once they're all pulled out, I did notice that this fabric is fairly delicate and was showing the stitch holes. You can actually fix that in a lot of fabrics by just grabbing the fabric pretty firmly on both sides and like stretching it on the diagonal a few times. You'll see me do it here in just a sec once I get these stitches out, and that really helps to sort of get rid of all those remaining stitch holes from things like gather stitches, or if you ever had to rip something for whatever reason. Once I'm done with that, I do line up the back center to mark where I want to sew the back of the skirt together. I usually do this on SD sized dolls, like the bigger dolls. I do about 2.5 inches down to accommodate the hips. It kind of varies per doll. I probably actually didn't need to use quite so much with Rosalind because her hip to waist ratio isn't quite as extreme as some dolls. I could have probably done 2 or even 1.5 inches, but it doesn't really make a big difference in the end. So I just did 2.5 inches and then sewed from that mark down to the bottom of the skirt. And then we tried it on and I love it. I'm so excited by this project. It's really turning out better than I thought it would. And the back, because there's overlap and the skirt is gathered, you can't even really see that extra opening we just left, so no big deal there. This is just testing the fit, seeing if I like it, and I really, really do. So because I know I like it, I'm gonna move on to the snaps. If you've been watching me for a while, you know how much I detest hand-sewn snaps, so I got out my trusty no-sew snaps, and I thought this fabric might be thin enough that I could get away with the like 1/4 inch ones, but no, there's too many layers in that back, so I put all those back and I got out the next biggest size, which I believe is 3/8 of an inch. And those work just fine. The little prongs are long enough to go through all the layers of fabric, and I crimp them down with the little crimper tool. This is actually the appropriate size for the crimper tool, so I didn't end up needing to use my pliers. But I'm just going along and trying to get them evenly spaced, both by eye and using the ruler as a little guide. The important part is to try to get them lined up on the back so that there's no bubbles. I think I did end up with a tiny bit of a bubble, but I'm not too fussed about it. So I'm just doing the other side of the snaps now, and we are almost done. So there you have it. I really love how this project turned out. Drafting for the Iplehouse, whatever you want to call them, HID dolls is so fun. I think it's the more realistic proportions. It just makes things just a touch easier than some of the more like super curvy dolls. And it's not that she doesn't have curves, it's just that her proportions are so much more realistic while still not actually being that realistic, but you know, it is what it is. Small scale also amplifies that kind of thing, so it's just very interesting. So anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. I hope some of this information on drafting helps you out in your own projects. I know my stuff isn't really traditional tutorials, it's more just me talking about the things that I know. That doesn't seem to work for everybody, but I hope for those of you that it does work for, that this will also help you. If this is the kind of thing that you want to see more of, please like and subscribe. That definitely helps me out, and I hope you have a great day. Bye bye.